Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sunday Musings. Hope you're all doing great. In today's musing, we're going to tackle a question, a criticism that, of course, surfaces in various communities online about leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints getting paid. Do they get paid? If so, how much? Why? This is something that many members of the church are not even really aware of, and sometimes when they learn about it, they get a little bit like, well, wait a minute, I thought that our church leaders work without pay, guided perhaps in part by scriptures on the topic, which we're about to get into. So let's unpack this a little bit first, starting with the Apostle Paul. Now, in the broader Christianity network of churches, many ministers and pastors and so forth are paid from the offerings of their parishioners, of the members of their particular sect. And the scripture that many, most, all of them rely on comes from the Apostle Paul. This is in 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul said, and I'm reading here, by the way, from the New International Version rather than the King James Version, just because this has a little more clarity to help you understand what he's saying. It says, "Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel." Now here Paul is referring to Old Testament priests, right? Continuing through the Jewish tradition in his day, saying, look, this is the economic circumstance that has been created for the church according to the law in the Bible. And then he's using that as a pattern to then say the same should apply to, apostles and missionaries under the kind of new Christian church in the same way that the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So you might read that and say, oh, well, that makes sense. Leaders of the church are it's a full-time job, etc. So they're supported by the members of the church. And yet, Paul, interestingly enough, in the very next verse, talks about that even though he's established this justification, this argument to say it's totally appropriate. Look, the Lord had this set up before with the priests in the temple, and they were supported from the offerings to the temple. So too it can be today, in Paul's day, with missionaries, apostles, etc. And then he says in the very next verse, "But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me, for I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast." So Paul is saying, this is legal, it's possible, it's justified, but I'm going one step above. I haven't exercised my right to be supported by you all, and I don't want you to support me because I would rather, and I'm quoting him again from the New International Version, the NIV translation, "I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast." So he's pridefully or righteously, I should say, boasting of the fact that he has not exercised this right. The opportunity is there. He feels justified in doing so if that's necessary or what he wants to do, but he considers it that much greater that he wants to maintain that position, and he would rather die than be supported by church members and lose that argument, that higher, standard. Now, this is of interest because many of the scriptures that I was referring to earlier that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints rely on when they think about should our leaders get paid, is that good, right, okay, or not, come from the Book of Mormon, where we read, for example, the following in Mosiah, "Yea, and all their priests and teachers should labor with their own hands for their support, in all cases, save it were in sickness or in much want. And doing these things, they did abound in the grace of God." So the priests and teachers should labor with their own hands for their support. That was the standard that they were doing in every case, except if they were sick or if there was much want, they were, struggling economically. And by doing this, they abounded in the grace of God. This, again, connects it to what Paul was saying. He was boasting of the fact that he was living this higher standard and refusing to be supported by the members of the church. We can go, for example, where it talks about priestcraft, 2 Nephi 26, it says that he commandeth, God, that there shall be no priestcrafts. For behold, priestcrafts are that men preach and set themselves up for a light unto the world, that they may get gain and praise of the world, but they seek not the welfare of Zion. Interestingly enough, some members of the church will think of priestcraft when it comes to any church leader getting paid, and they kind of equate that with priestcraft, I think wrongly, because this verse does not condemn payment if it's for the welfare of Zion, right? It's those who seek not the welfare of Zion, who are doing it for personal gain, that they may get gain and praise of the world. If you've got, for example, a very wealthy businessman taking a massive pay cut to respond to a church calling, that, I think by definition, is the opposite of seeking gain. So whether or not they're compensated or not, perhaps it's relative to their experience. If you're making $1 million a year as a executive at your large company, and then you get called to be, a senior leader for the church and you get a stipend, you can't really argue, I think, that someone in that circumstance is seeking gain. So we'll talk a little bit later about how much church leaders are getting paid, how wealthy they are, things like that. But for now, this verse, the priestcraft, I don't know that it so much fits in the modern context. Certainly there is priestcraft. There are people who are trying to monetize their feelings on the gospel. It's among other reasons why I don't monetize my YouTube channel. I just want to be able to share these thoughts without that perception of, personal gain or whatever. Not that I'm against that. I write books, you just had earlier flash on your screen, hey, go get books. But of course, there's a ton of operational costs in producing books, and there's basically almost zero in doing this podcast. So whatever. Point is, priestcraft, I think, is kind of a distinct thing. And just because leaders of the church are getting a stipend, I don't know that that means they're seeking gain or that inherently they're not seeking for the welfare of Zion. But then we go 2 verses later in the same chapter, 2 Nephi, and it says, but the laborer in Zion shall labor for Zion, for if they labor for money, they shall perish. That's interesting. So especially in contrast to the priestcraft argument that, again, this higher standard of if you're laboring for Zion, then you shouldn't be doing it for money. Now, you could interpret that and say, just because you're getting money doesn't mean you're doing it for money. Like, I can be compensated for something, but that's not why I'm doing it, right? I really want to go give this speech, and they're willing to pay me, and they want to pay me, but that's not why I could still decline it. We'll get into that in a little bit. Right? But just because I'm receiving money doesn't mean I'm doing it for the money. So maybe there's a nuance here where if they labor for money, they shall perish. I still think that could mean those who are laboring for the purpose of getting gain, for the purpose of acquiring money, those are the ones who shall perish, not just anyone who receives, money. Let's do a final example from the scriptures, and then we'll get into what modern leaders have said about this. Let's wrap up the scriptural examples with Alma. He's the high priest. This comes from chapter 30, and he says, notwithstanding the many labors which I've performed in the church, I've never received so much as one senein for my labor. Neither has any of my brethren, save it were in the judgment seat. And then we have received only according to the law for our time. And now if we do not receive anything for our labors in the church, what doth it profit us to labor in the church, save it were to declare the truth, that we may have rejoicings in the joy of our brethren? So he's basically saying, just like I was kind of, I'm not monetizing the podcast, therefore it's more, pure or whatever, right? That I'm just doing this because I want to declare what I believe to be the truth. Here's Alma saying, using that argument, like, what does it profit us to work in the church since we're not getting any money unless we were doing this because we passionately believe this stuff is true and that we want to share it, right? And he's saying, I've performed many labors in the church, but we haven't even received so much as a penny for our labor. Again, he's connecting it kind of like Paul, this higher standard of not receiving any gain. Not just that they're getting gain, but that's not the reason they're doing it. He's just saying, like, I wash my hands of all this, right? Just like we read in Mosiah, that the priests and teachers should labor with their own hands for their support unless they were sick or there was much want. Okay. What have leaders of the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints said about this topic? Now, there's a whole long list someone has compiled of all the references that can be even, considered to be touching on this topic, and they categorized them and they whatever. I'm just curating a select few to give you a sampling of many similar comments that other leaders of the church have said. So by no means is this comprehensive. Let's begin in 1974 with Elder Boyd Packer. The context of what he's saying is he's talking about this story where the branch president and the missionaries are visiting a family that had declined to join the church. And so the branch president is asking them a variety of questions, right? Hey, did the missionaries tell you about tithing? Did they tell you about fast offerings? Did the missionaries tell you about the welfare program? And he's kind of bringing all these things up. And then he says the following.
Did they also tell you that we have no professional clergy? All of us contribute our time, our talents, our means, travel, work, all to help, and we're not paid for it in money.
All right, so we'll get in a few minutes of what does professional clergy mean? What is this clergy thing? But Packer is saying all of us. Now, he's quoting a branch president, so he's an apostle, but he's quoting a branch president saying, all of us contribute our time or talents or means, right? But as we'll talk about, like, this might be a little ambiguous that an apostle is saying it, and is that implying that the apostles are also contributing time, talents, and means and not being paid for it in money, right? Or is this confined just to the branch presidents, the bishops, and things like that? We'll stick with Elder Packer for a minute. Fast forward 5 years, 1979. He said that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there is no paid ministry, no professional clergy, as is common in other churches. So again, this emphasis on professional clergy when we're talking about a paid ministry. Now, some of the statements that leaders of the church have said on this topic connect the fact of receiving no payment, no money, with local ministry, local leaders of the church only. For example, here's from 2009. This is Daniel Johnson, one of the 70. Here's what let's see. He said, one of the practices that distinguishes the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that of having lay shepherds. We have no paid clergy in the wards, branches, stakes, and districts of the church. Rather, the members themselves minister to each other. So again, we'll discuss what is clergy in a moment. I thought I'd have a video for this guy, but it was just a text discourse, so I read it to you instead. We have no paid clergy in the wards, the branches, the stakes, the districts. So again, connecting this idea of payment with local leaders, clergy, again. All right, here is a video clip. This is from then Elder Oaks, 2002. Sometimes even though the local issue is mentioned, that this is applying to local leaders, it can still be, I think, a little confusing. Here's what then Elder Oaks had to say.
Indeed, one of the distinguishing characteristics of this church is the fact that we have no paid or professional clergy in our thousands of local congregations and in the regional stakes, districts, and missions that oversee them. As an essential part of God's plan for His children, the leadership and work of His church is provided by His children, who give their time freely for the service of God and their fellow man.
Okay, so again, he's talking about local congregations, no paid or professional clergy, again, using that word, which we're about to get to. But then he calls an essential part of God's plan that the leadership and work of His church is provided by those who give their time freely. Now, again, a little confusing perhaps, because what does he mean by leadership and who performs the work? Right? Because when we say the leadership of the church, most of us will think about, First Presidency, Quorum of the 12, and the 70. And so here's Elder Oaks himself saying that this is an essential part of God's plan, that the leadership is giving of their time freely. Even though when he said no paid or professional clergy, he was saying local congregations. Let's wrap with another example. This is Elder M. Russell Ballard, 2006, showing again that sometimes this can be a little ambiguous.
The Lord in His infinite wisdom has designed His church to operate with a lay ministry. That means we have been charged to watch over one another and to serve one another.
Okay, ambiguous in the sense that he's saying the church operates with a lay ministry, and then he says he's, an apostle, but he's saying we have been charged to watch over one another and serve one another after talking about the ministry. So you can see, I think, how sometimes members of the church, not really seeing the nuance and the finer details and the whatever, might get caught up and lost in this idea of like, okay, the broad way that you're talking about this just makes me feel like no leader of the church is getting paid, right? So it's a little, I think, potentially confusing. So, Elder Ballard there talking about that we have a lay ministry. We've talked about professional clergy, paid clergy. So what is this clergy business? Well, the modern definition, I often share the 1828 definition when we're talking about Scripture and Revelations, because that's kind of the definitional context for that era. But since these are modern, recent leaders of the church talking about clergy, let's look at what the recent definition is. For Merriam-Webster, clergy is a group ordained to perform pastoral or priesthood functions in a Christian church. I swapped out the word priesthood. They actually used sacerdotal. So perform pastoral or sacerdotal functions in a Christian church. Anyone who knows Spanish or other, Romance languages, sacerdocio is the priesthood. So it's just from the Latin root. Anyways, clergy is a group ordained to perform pastoral or priesthood type functions in a Christian church. Now, I will concede that the Quorum of the 12, the First Presidency, right, these guys are not in a pastoral position. What does that even mean? Again, from Merriam-Webster, pastoral means spiritual care or guidance, especially of a congregation. So, of course, those who are charged with pastoral care are the bishops and the branch presidents and their counselors at a local level who are providing the regular spiritual care and guidance, right, for a congregation. So it makes sense that the top leaders of the church are not performing a pastoral duty, but that was one of two prongs of the definition of clergy. So it was pastoral, but the other one was priesthood functions. These guys definitely perform priesthood functions, right? No one, I think, would quibble with that. So, okay, they're not doing pastoral, but they are doing priesthood functions. So are they clergy? Maybe, right? So if they're saying we don't have a professional clergy, in that they're right. It's not like you go to BYU to get your, clergy certificate so you can be a leader of the church. So we don't have a professional clergy. But depending on how you want to define the term clergy, if you want to say that the leaders of the church do have a priesthood function, at least in some respects, we do have a paid clergy, perhaps. Now, I would also note that, the apostles are special witnesses intended to preach, intended to testify, not just manage administratively the affairs of the church, right? But there's a preaching function. I mean, the early apostles, Jesus told them, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. This was the original charge to the apostles. In modern Revelation, section 107, it says the 12 traveling counselors are to be called the 12 apostles, or special witnesses of the name of Christ in all the world, similarly charged with preaching the gospel. So that's not, again, necessarily a pastoral function, but it is very much this, priesthood office and this, preaching duty to go around the world and to do this. And again, like the Apostle Paul said, it's like, well, hey, the Levites in the temple were being funded by the people contributing, so it's okay for missionaries and apostles to do, right? So there's like this justification argument, but then there's this higher level, it appears, of him saying, hey, don't let me not be able to boast. And, Mosiah and Alma and all these guys that are like, hey, I labor with my own hands, and what does this profit us other than we love the truth and we want to share the truth? So now the question, are modern church leaders paid? This is a quote from the church website, which says, general authorities leave their careers when they are called into full-time church service. When they do so, they are given a living allowance, which enables them to focus all of their time on serving in the church. This practice allows for far more church members on a worldwide basis to be considered for a calling to serve as a general authority, rather than limiting considerations to only those who may be financially independent. The living allowance is uniform for all general authorities. None of the funds for this living allowance come from the tithing of church members, but instead from the proceeds of the church's financial investments. We'll get into that towards the end of this musing. I have a little quibble with that. it's also important to note here that this statement does not include the third quorum of the 70 or the fourth or the fifth or, whatever, or the area 70. These guys are part-time. They're not general authorities. They're not paid. This refers to the first presidency, the quorum of the 12, and the first and second quorums of the 70, who are general authorities, who are called full-time. And then the church's argument is that this living allowance enables them to focus all of their time on serving the church, that it opens up the pool of candidates, right? Because if there was no living allowance, then only the wealthy would be able to do it. That's an interesting argument we'll talk about. And so you can open the net, right? And then it's uniform. It's the same for everyone. It's not like, ooh, you got promoted to be an apostle from a 70. Here's your boost in payment, right? It's equal across the board. Now, some years ago, there were some, Mormon leaks is what they were called, and this website got access to some leaked documents where we can learn a little bit about compensation from the church to church leaders. So here, for example, from the year 2000 is an image of Elder Eyring's payroll, where you can see, what his living allowance was, child allowance, parsonage. Parsonage, by the way, being a housing allowance. So in the United States, parsonage is not taxed. So like housing that's provided for clergy, whether that's actual housing or reimbursement for their own home, that is a tax deductible income. And so if the church is paying parsonage, as it was for Elder Eyring, to the tune of, $827 in a 2-week period, you can do the math to extrapolate that out for a year, go back 25 years when inflation was not as bad and the dollar had more purchasing power, etc. The point is, this is an interesting insight because before this had never really been disclosed with any level of detail. This was not intended to be disclosed. It was, as I said, leaked. It wasn't the only one. Here, for example, is Elder Worthland's. You can see as well, this is from 2 years later, one pay stub from the year 2002, where again, you see living allowance and parsonage. So he doesn't have a child allowance. He's older at this time, presumably Elder Eyring, because he got a child allowance, still had some dependents, one or more. But it's kind of interesting to see the breakdown of specifically what's being paid. This is easily discoverable on the internet now that it was leaked and is put online. So I feel no qualms about sharing it here, even though certainly from the church's position this was not intended to be public. Again, I'll comment on that in just a moment as well. There's a website called thewidowsmite.org. I'm not going to recommend it or anything, just mentioning it that this is where I found the following chart, as well as some additional information. These folks, I don't know anything about them, but they're attempting to address the church's use of funds and investments, and they have their own angle and agenda. So again, I'm not suggesting that you pay them any heed other than, they've done some interesting compilations on some of this data. So here's this chart, for example, using some of the documented in dark blue examples of church leaders getting paid. Of course, this is uniform, as the church says, so we know this is for all the top leaders of the church. And then they can basically, using a little math, compute the payment year over year, which ends up being about a 3.1% increase. So in the year 2000, when we saw Elder Eyring's, the total compensation, whatever that is, about $85,000 a year, and now it's like $180,000 25 years later. Now that's at a compounding 3% one increase. Basically, the stated inflation rate of the consumer price index, the government's official decree of what inflation is, which is highly manipulated. They have this basket of goods that they're like, oh, we're going to only judge inflation based on these things, and they exclude all kinds of things that are massively increasing in value. So if you believe that inflation has only been over the past quarter century 3% a year, then you got to take an econ course or read a Tuttle Twins book or something. I don't know what to tell you, but nonetheless, that is what's being afforded to church leaders, is just the standard 3%, which is interesting. To me, the takeaway here is that their stipend had more purchasing power 25 years ago than it does today, because if they've only been getting 3% raises and inflation, let's say it's been 6 or 8, was spread over all the years and so forth, they're actually losing money, losing purchasing power, even though nominally their dollars are going up. Nonetheless, it's an interesting thing to consider and look at, especially compared to, salaries that, you or your spouse may be earning, or others that top leaders of the church. Now, granted, this is a multi-billion-dollar organization. Any other organization at this level, leaders would be making 10x or more type of money comparatively. So relative to other institutions, this is very low sums for the type of charge that these individuals are given. Not that this should be judged based on what the world does or anything. I'm just bringing that up as an interesting point to note. That same analysis of the financial data says that as of 2023, the total compensation given to general authorities is about $250,000. So there's the base salary, but then there's, the parsonage that we talked about, the housing stuff, some other perks that are lumped in, insurance and whatnot, right? Benefits. So $250,000 total compensation for each of the 123 top leaders of the church, totals around $30 million in compensation for senior leadership. So you might say, well, this is really a function of being, as I said, a large multi-billion-dollar organization. Like, doesn't it make sense that we would have, people compensated at this level to have good leaders of the church? The church themselves saying that this is all about helping them focus all of their time on serving the church. But to that, someone might say, well, what about Alma, right? And he's saying, yeah, I've got this. When I was the judge, I got compensated for my time, but for all of my duties here, I wasn't getting compensated. Some might say, well, when you were also the chief judge, that was a distraction for you to govern the church, which is in part why Alma said, sayonara, I'm going to go, preach instead. Mosiah, right, doing his personal labor, working himself. So is there a benefit to freeing up all one's time for this massive global organization, far bigger, by the way, than anything Alma and Mosiah were doing? So you can say on a relative basis what they were dealing with could be done and still have a side hustle of like having your own job or working on your own. But maybe there's an argument to be made that like an organization as big as the church is today necessitates full-time labor. And using the church's argument further, if we presume that there ought to be full-time labor, we want it to be open to all and not just those who can afford to provide full-time labor. So let's just standardize and provide a living stipend for everyone. Interesting counter-argument might be that perhaps there's a benefit to having church leaders who remain involved in a career, maybe to ground them or connect them to people. I don't know, right? Granted, in our culture with all the celebrity worship or whatever, if you've got some apostle that's, just working in an office a few days a week or going to board meetings or whatever, like there's going to be people that are all funky about that. So maybe the size of the organization and the way that our culture is kind of necessitates just having a separation. And even though there could be benefits of still being kind of involved in providing for yourself and whatnot, maybe there is kind of a necessity or a justification to do so. This practice, by the way, seems to have begun several decades ago of compensating church leaders like this. Now, it's not the only time in the early church that it's happened. We'll talk about a scripture in just a moment that provides the modern justification for this. But the current practice is only, from what I could find, a few decades old. I couldn't find precisely when it began, perhaps in part because none of this was being divulged or shared or done through common consent. The members weren't being informed. This stuff, has had to leak out. Or you've had some statements, we'll get into President Hinckley's in a bit, where they've divulged that this is happening. One interesting question here is, do these leaders of the church need these stipends? Many of these individuals, as we talked about on a past musing, have come from very successful professions where they earned large sums of money. I mean, Elder Stevenson is supposed to be like a billionaire because he had this like fitness company that was going public right before he was called. And, you've got doctors and lawyers and businessmen, and not all of them, as I talked about in that past musing. Some are just, longtime employees of the church and whatnot. Nonetheless, if you're managing your finances well, you're investing, you've got retirement and so forth. It's an interesting question. Do these individuals who are typically octogenarians at this point, they're retired, most of them are out of business, is the stipend needed? So again, if the church's statement is that we want to pay everyone so that it levels the playing field and we're not just getting those who can financially afford to serve, could there not be an argument in reverse that says if someone needs to be compensated for their labors, then go ahead and pay them, but otherwise let's not do that, right? I think again of Mosiah. The priests and teachers should labor with their own hands for their support in all cases, save it were in sickness or in much want. So perhaps there's a case to be made that there should be no compensation to leaders of the church if they don't need it. But if they, because of their much wants or sickness or whatever, need it, then there is this baseline living allowance that is provided. If you're from some third world country and your currency has been destroyed through hyperinflation and government mismanagement, and you've been living in poverty, but you've been dedicating your life to the church and you're called to be a senior leader of the church, right? Great. Like, here's a living allowance opportunity so that you can dedicate your time to the church. But if you're a billionaire, right, and you've got, or you're just a middle class, whatever, and you saved and invested, and now you're retired and you're living off your retirement income just fine, do you need and should there be provided to you a living allowance if you don't actually need it to be living? Interesting question, right? I think, for example, is he still doing this? I know he did in his first term, where Trump would donate his salary, right? He's like, I don't need this, and he would donate it. Like, say all you want about the guy, but I think that's kind of interesting and noble. What would that look like? Could a general authority do that, right? I mean, perhaps you could argue that would make everyone else look bad if someone were to, and to be fair, maybe someone is quietly doing it. Maybe some of these, mega millionaires are just like, no, I'm not going to participate in that. So for all we know, this could be happening. They just not are public about it. And if they were public about it, it would kind of like subtly shame those who were doing it, and that wouldn't be their intent nor desire. So everything is kept quiet. And we don't know if any of them are refusing this, right, and donating it. If they're going to donate it to anyone, they're just going to donate it to the church. So really, I don't think it's I got my salary and I'm going to donate to this other organization. I think they would just say, I'm going to opt out of doing that. So maybe some are and just doing it very privately. Okay, let's wrap up with a few thoughts. Some of these I've teased earlier on, including this one. This comes from section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is the law that the saints were waiting for, basically the law of consecration. And this was much anticipated. And Joseph kind of runs everyone through, all right, here's the revelation. Here's what God is saying on this topic. Let's get into verses 71 and beyond. He says that the elders or high priests who are appointed to assist the bishop as counselors in all things are to have their families supported out of the property which is consecrated to the bishop for the good of the poor and for other purposes as before mentioned. Or they are to receive a just remuneration for all their services, either a stewardship or otherwise, as may be thought best or decided by the counselors and bishop. And the bishop also shall receive his support or a just remuneration for all his services in the church. So much like Paul early on was saying, hey, this is legit. The Old Testament temple priests were doing it. It's okay for missionaries and apostles today to do it. So too in the law of consecration, when the Lord is revealing his law unto all the saints, he's saying the consecrated goods that you're providing are not just for the poor. They're also for, the affairs of the church, for the good of the poor and for other purposes. Right. And so the bishop and his counselors who are over temporal matters, you might say that they're kind of over administrative stuff for the church. They're not the ones preaching. They're not the apostles. Right. But they're the ones kind of managing the administrative affairs. Then it's like, hey, they're getting a just remuneration for all of their services. Similarly, a few sections later in 51, this is talking about the presiding bishop who's over temporal affairs again. And it says, and let him also reserve unto himself for his own wants, and for the wants of his family, as he shall be employed in doing this business. So again, here we see, at least for those charged with the temporal affairs of the church, not necessarily the apostles, it doesn't say, hey, traveling counselors who are out preaching the gospel, here's this stipend. This is in the context of those managing the temporal affairs, which in many cases now, because of the size of the church and all the departments. There's still, of course, a presiding bishopric and all that they do, but I think you can make an argument that the top leaders of the church are at least the first presidency and the quorum of the 12. I don't know so much about the 70, are involved in a lot of temporal administrative stuff. So maybe the feeling is like, hey, these verses were about the presiding bishop and his counselors, but they kind of like extend out to other people involved in that. I don't know if that's being interpreted that way. Ultimately, I think that payment is fine. I think there's enough scriptural justification for it, right? If you have wants, I do think it makes sense to have a policy where it's like, this is available if you need it, because we want to have an open playing field and we do want everyone to be able to serve, but please only take the widow's mite if you need it for your family, right? If this is going to be the difference between you being able to serve in a full-time capacity or not, then take it. That's what it's here for. But, you know, if you've got millions and millions in retirement income and now you're not going to be going on all these crazy lavish vacations or buying all this stuff, so because you're going to be focused on the work, your expenses are likely going to be a bit lower, you know, or even like reimburse their like a few little things. But you can encourage, I think, by way of policy, taking the living allowance if it's not needed. I think that could be interesting, beneficial. Again, to say this is in case of sickness and wants. So if you have want, right, not just like, I desire these things, I want a Lamborghini. It's not that type of want. It's you are in want of something, you lack something. So if you're a third world, whatever, leader of the church, and you are in want of a home and income to buy groceries and everything, then let's provide that for you. And that makes sense. I don't think it makes sense for mega millionaire retirees to be getting a living allowance on top of that. That doesn't make as much sense to me. So for me, payment is fine. I don't really quibble with that. My concern is that while payment is fine, the inconsistency of the message is not. I think more clarity is needed. Again, those quotes from church leaders, it's like, oh, professional clergy, paid clergy, all of us, we, right? And these terms, it's like, well, wait a minute. Are they talking about just like the bishops and the branch presidents, or are they talking about themselves? There's a broader issue here, I think, about this clarity, which is, as I've said in a past musing, you know, should the church's finances be transparent? And I think they ought to be. I don't think we should need leaks to some random website to kind of understand this stuff, nor just hearing from the church's auditor who stands up once in a year and is like, hey, everything's good, right? And so I, in that musing, dove into detail about why I think the finances should be transparent. Again, you can go to sundaymusings.org, and I have the drop down I've had forever, but there's also now a search field. So you can just search finances, for example, or transparent, and you should see that come up. And if you want to go look at that past musing. I want to wrap up with a quote from a clip of a video from then Elder President Hinckley. He was the second counselor in the first presidency. This is 1985, where he was openly talking about this topic. Take a look.
I should like to add parenthetically for your information that the living allowances given the general authorities, which are very modest in comparison with executive compensation in industry and the professions, come from this business income and not from the tithing of the people.
So I think he's right in that, as I said, these living allowances are very modest compared to executive compensation in other industries. So if we're comparing ourselves to the Babylonian corporate America, whatever, totally, right? There's a massive reduction in pay, which is among the reasons why I think that wealthy business people who take these positions are not necessarily doing it to seek gain. I do want to quibble a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, about this idea that it comes from the business income and not from the tithing of the people, right? And that's been said like in recent years when the church was getting some public flack for like hiding some of its investments and not filling out these forms, which would have had the effect of being a little more transparent and public. So the church was trying to like play this shell game of like squirreling away investments in these different shell companies to avoid reporting requirements. Again, it may have been that exact musing where I talked about it, or maybe not. Again, sundaymusings.org, go type in finances or transparency and you'll find it. But this idea that compensation for the leaders of the church doesn't come from the tithing of the people, it comes from the business income. But where does the business income come from? Where did we get the funds to buy these businesses, operate these businesses, invest in these businesses, acquire these businesses, buy the land, buy the cows, buy the processing plants, all the things, right? Now, as the businesses have succeeded over the years, you can leverage the profits of the business and roll it right back into growing the business. But everything got its start from the tithing of the people. And ultimately, at the end of the day, money is fungible, which means that it's not like there's a tithing bucket and an investment bucket. The church just has all these assets and they can be moved around, which is among other reasons why our tithing slips now say, hey, just because you're donating to this fund doesn't guarantee it's going to stay in that fund. The church reserves the right to move the money around however they want. This is the case with any organization. It's the case with the organization I founded and oversee, right? Money is fungible. It's not like there's a law that it has to stay in this bucket or that, budget allocation. And so just because, right, it's not like Connor paid, $100 in tithing and, oh, we didn't touch that $100. That $100 went to tithing and not over to, helping us invest the money in the market or buy this business. To me, it's all the same. All of this flows back to tithing. You can't really separate it. It's all one bucket. Everything that the church has and has acquired and has built has a connection to and derives from the tithing of the people. So I just want to quibble a little bit with President Hinckley there. I don't think that we can make that distinction. But the rest of what he says, I think, is accurate. It's modest by comparison. I don't think these guys are seeking gain as a result, because they're taking often such massive pay cuts. Not all of them. I mean, some of them have been teachers for a long time or whatever, and what they're getting compensated now by way of living allowance is very comfortable and kind of normal for them. So my takeaway from this, my whole point is not that, again, payment is bad. I think payment should be reserved for cases where it's financially necessary to level the playing field. I think that's a totally valid argument. In cases of want, makes total sense. I would like to see, I'd be curious to know if we have leaders of the church who are opting out of this and just saying, I don't want that, right? That would be really interesting to publicly surface, even if it would create a little bit of unhealthy tension or disparity between colleagues. But I'd be very curious about that if that's been done at all. I'd love to see the policy change so that the living allowance is only for those who need it. And in all things, I just would want to be more clear and transparent. Let's not have confused members who are led to believe, oh, we don't get paid at all, but then they see this random quote or, hey, 40 years ago, President Hinckley said this, therefore you should know better because, this hasn't been hidden. It's been said, right? While all along we're getting statements from church talking about we have no paid clergy, no professional clergy, local ministry, we don't get paid, we volunteer our time, we do all this to render service. I've heard from and seen a lot of people get a little hung up on this idea because they were kind of led to believe or just assumed from all these little quotes they've heard that, oh, our church leaders don't get paid, period. And then they come across this online and they're like, oh my gosh, I've been lied to or whatever. So again, I just think transparency, clarity, let's be on the up and up, but maybe let's have a conversation about saying we're going to reserve this compensation, living allowance only for those who actually need it. All these other guys who have their retirement plans and they're living large off of their investments and whatever, like they can work full time for the church. They don't need the living allowance. So I'd be curious what you think. Did I miss any quotes, any other insights that you have? We don't know a lot about this just because, again, some of this had to get leaked or there's little quotes here and there. So all the more reason, I think, why, as I said in that other musing, the church's finances, I think, would benefit us all if we do operate from common consent, if we're supposed to operate from common consent. There needs to be transparency. We need to have information to have informed consent rather than just rubber stamping stuff that we know very little, if not nothing about. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? Did I miss anything? What are your thoughts? Is this an issue for you? Do you not care? I'd love to get your thoughts, and I'll see you next week.